Hi everyone, we are going to shift our focus just a bit in our conversations about borders and political geography. Today we're going to talk about how borders interact with the government. In other words, how borders what is the relationship between borders and the forms of government in various states. So we've talked at this point at length about borders, their role, their function, and on a very basic level, we've already discussed this, that borders shape the state. They give them their defined boundaries. And the resulting territory that can be governed from those borders can be governed in many different ways. And the ways in which a country is governed often reflects the needs of the state or the goals of that particular state's government. So for example, one form of government is called a unitary government, or I should say really that's a category of different types of governments. In a unitary government, the state has, the central government of the country has the most power. I'm going to say that very simplistically. The central government in the state has the most power. Take a look at the graphic on the right-hand side. Consider the United States our national government versus our state government. In the United States, we do not follow a unitary system because our central government does not have more power than the states necessarily. It has more of a reciprocal relationship. In a unitary state like France, the central government, so the national government, has primary power. So you can see, I like this graphic here because it portrays the idea that the central government is giving power to those regional governments, those provinces, or those regions of government. So in the case of a unitary government such as France, the central government is going to have significant power and more power than the state governments. This is often common in compact states because if you look over there on the shape of France, a compact state often has a strong central government because that central government is well situated to meet the needs of the entire people, whereas in something like an elongated or a fragmented state, it might be necessary to devolve some of that power to regions that are farther outside of the central government's reach. Another key example of a unitary government. So we watched that video in class about the UK. What is the UK? And the four countries that comprise the United Kingdom. So just a reminder of that at the top there, that the countries of the UK include England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. In the United Kingdom, I'm going to read the definition, then I'm going to break that down. In the United Kingdom, the authority of the devolved governments cannot supersede the power of the UK Parliament. Very simplistically, the power of these individual these sort of regional governments, if you will, these state governments cannot supersede the central authority. Let's go back to the graphic. Think of that central government as the Parliament across all of the UK. The regional governments, the state governments, so Ireland, Wales, Scotland, cannot supersede, rise above the power of the central government. That would be a unitary state system. That's kind of it's increasingly becoming a thing of the past to have a unitary state government. What is far more common, what is far more essentially the way of the future is a federal government. This here is what we have in the United States. This is known as federalism. And this is when a state, country, remember, when a state places most power in the hands of local authorities. Now you may not think that right away, but because most of us haven't yet taken government, but the United States, the national government, though Barack Obama is powerful, though the Supreme Court is powerful, though the Congress is powerful, they do not necessarily have more power at all in all arenas of life than the state governments. Let me explain. The state governments have exclusive control in the United States over education. Though Barack Obama may want teachers to do something, he cannot make it, he does not have the authority to control the decisions of a local school. That power is reserved specifically for the states. So back to these general concepts. In a unitary government, the central government has more power. In that federal government, there is either a reciprocal relationship, meaning the national government has some power, the states have some power, or simply the state governments will have significant power. I'm going to move forward for just a second before I break down those two other bullet points. I want to show you a quick graphic just to compare and contrast the two. On the left-hand side, we have the unitary government. You'll see the central government is distributing that power to the regional governments, to the sub-governments. The middle there is the federal government, the federal system, where the central government and the sub-units, those regional governments, in our case in the United States, that would be the example of the states, we all share power. So the national government has exclusive control over some things, such as foreign policy, whereas the state governments have specific control over other areas of life, and powers that are not given to the national government will automatically go to the state governments. So it's a federal government. Now let's bring this back into the realm of geography. The federal system, more and more countries are moving towards this federal system. More and more countries are devolving power from the central government and empowering regional governments. And this is largely, a lot of this is a factor in relationship to all the other units that we've studied, the areas of a country with greater population, the areas of a country that maybe have an ethnic group that's looking for some self-determination, so they will devolve power, as we saw in the case in Switzerland. So the federal system essentially helps ensure that the regional authorities are still maintained within this greater state, but often have a greater sense of autonomy and to some degree, some sovereignty. This is generally a system that's effective for governing large territories. And let's flip back into our concepts of morphology and state and the size of the states. In the United States, we break our country down into regions. We call them states. Mighty confusing for us human geographers. But these regional governments all have a certain element of power. Similarly, in the very large state of Mexico, I guess very might be a strong term, but this larger state of Mexico, you see that we have, they're called estados, similar concept to our regional governments. They too follow a federal system, strong national government, but also strong state governments that share the power, or regional governments, excuse me, that share the power. In India, you see again, we have a large territory. It makes a lot of sense to devolve some of that power away from the central government and empower the regional authorities, or the union territories in the states, as they're called in India. Larger territories tend to use this federal system to ensure that the country, essentially it empowers nationalism, because it ensures the country has those centripetal forces that still bind them together without the risk of balkanization, without the risk of the states devolving or balkanizing and breaking apart. So that's kind of the conception here. Brazil, similarly. Brazil, you can see even where the capital city is in Brazil, look down to Brasilia, you can see that the central authority here, if a national government is within just that single place, it's difficult to maintain authority across this large regions. Sometimes states choose to move their capital city for this purpose, to better accommodate, but alternatively, you could just set up a federal system where regional governments have more power. Heading back here, I think I hit that. Nope, last one. Now, let me go back, let me contradict just what I just said. Confusing, I know. Often, a federal government system is used to ensure, to govern a large territory, but that's not always the case. So, for example, Belgium, which is a small state, practices federalism. They have a federal government. And in contrast, China, which is almost to a T the size of the United States, practices a unitary system. I'm going to tie this right back to what I said at the very beginning. This is because, right at the top, that first bullet point, the type of government often reflects the needs or the goals of the state government. So in the case of China, China practices a unitary government because they're a communist state. In communism, the government must control the lives of the people to a larger degree than is the case in, say, a capitalist system or a democratic system, better example. So in other words, the Chinese government needs their central authority to have much greater power than the authorities, than the regional governments. They must maintain that strong central authority. So therefore, even though they are large, they practice a unitary system. But let me re-emphasize on the whole that generally speaking, the areas of the world, as globalization occurs, as we have more diversity, if we have greater voice for certain groups of people, or less voice for others, we have a general global trend moving towards federalism. Okay, last thing I want to emphasize here, this last, please put, we already have the definitions of unitary and federal. Please add on the left-hand side of your notes, Confederate government, okay, or Confederacy, either one. I want you to add this because you'll notice that in a Confederate government, the regional powers have more power than the central government. This is uncommon in modern times, but it's not unheard of. That the Confederate governments, the regional governments, have more power than the central government. We're going to touch back on this when we talk about certain supranational organizations. But keep that in mind, the Confederate form of government, where the regional governments have even more power than the central government. Keep it in mind because when we look at how the United States evolved into their own political system, we went from, going back to the graphic, we went from this Confederate system to the middle of this. Actually, really, we went from the unitary government, which would be the monarch of England, then Confederacy, then federalism. So let's break down what I just said. On the left-hand side of your notes, please put political evolution of the United States, which is the, so we're going to take a look at how is it that the United States evolved through these different forms of government. For those of you who've already taken government, please forgive me. This will be repetitious, and U.S. history for that matter. Okay, so to start us off, we started our existence, political existence, as a colony. We were a British colony. And this is why the United States is considered to be an immigrant state on the left-hand side, the immigrant state, because the majority of the population in the United States is made up of immigrants and their descendants. Now, I'm going to use my phrasing carefully here because there's this enormous, this was not all voluntary migration. The northern colonies, the New England colonies, were settled by groups of people like the Puritans and the Pilgrims who were seeking either religious freedom or a new opportunity to practice a different form of faith. In contrast, the southern colonies were colonized by people looking for economic opportunity. And then, of course, the extension thereof was the forced migration of millions of enslaved Africans who came to the United States as well. Regrouping. Step one of our political evolution, we were a colony. We were under the unitary state of the British king. So, after we sought our independence, and one other quick side note, the immigrant state concept, I've noticed once before the AP exam asked about immigrant states, and they mentioned Australia. Australia, too, is an immigrant state, where the majority of the population is currently comprised of descendants. That is not to negate the native population of Australia, who were there well before those immigrants came. But just a little side note, that another example the AP exam mentioned of an immigrant state was Australia. Okay, back to our evolution. We were a British colony. We evolved into a confederation. So we fought our Revolutionary War, and we sought our independence. We had a strong sense of self-determination, and we had a strong sense that we would be able to govern ourselves. After we won the Revolutionary War, we were extremely fearful of establishing a system. Go back to the graphic. We had that unitary government under the king. We wanted more power, and we were fearful of creating a system where the central government would be powerful again. So the early politicians created what's known as the Articles of Confederation. So step two of our process was creating a confederation. In the confederation, those regional governments, so in our case of the United States, each one of our states had a very strong central government and a very strong state government, weak central government. But what we quickly realized is that it was an extremely ineffective system because the central government had no power to create an army, no power to tax. So this was not an effective way to govern a new country, is what we discovered. So lastly, we ended up with our current system that was established by the Constitution of the federal system, where we have a representative democracy. We elect people who in turn speak on our behalf, for the most part, in theory, I guess. Okay. But within a country as well, there's a whole other element of governing of borders within a country. So borders can also cause conflict in the governance. In other words, how the country itself is governed. There's the primary example of that is within this subfield of political geography called electoral geography. So electoral geography is essentially looking at the way in which boundaries are influencing voting patterns, the way in which boundaries are influencing voter representation. How are we organizing the way people are voting based upon boundaries and borders? That is a direct reflection back here to our representative democracy. We are all grouped into what are called census districts, or congressional districts, but really, and then the census is then what tells us where those congressional districts should be drawn. So that seems reasonable. Look at a map, see where people live, based on where people live, determine how many votes those people should get based on the size of their population. Seems pretty logical. However, what often happens is a very illegal practice known as gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is when when groups specifically manipulate. To manipulate is to shift to be in your particular favor, or to do something and with the purpose of it being advantageous for yourself or your cause. So gerrymandering is when you're redrawing or manipulating political boundaries for the gain of one of those major parties. It's completely illegal, but it still happens. So for example, look at that Congressional District 4. If you're looking at a map and you were creating a region, irrespective of population, there is no way that that's the most logical region that you would create. People do these things, like these other two districts. Here's one in South Carolina, Congressional District 12 and Congressional District 38. These are done to ensure that the election will be manipulated in favor of one particular group. That's a brief definition. I want to show you two quick YouTube videos that are excellent explanations of how gerrymandering influences. Where's my other? Oh, I got gerrymandering. All right, well, we'll start with this one, and then we watch it. Oh, there it is, gerrymandering through pizza. So this is actually a really good explanation of how it is that gerrymandering is so unfair. And that's the question, one of your analysis questions is, what is gerrymandering and why is it so unfair? So here we go.
Redistricting is how states change the boundaries of areas that vote for each of their congressional seats in the House of Representatives. In some states, the process is done by a bipartisan committee to make sure that each slice has an even number of pepper voters and pineapple voters. But in 36 states, the process is done by whichever party is in charge. This means you could wind up with 3 slices that are majority green pepper. It's not exactly fair to the pineapple. For instance, in North Carolina, there was a district that used to be 60% onion voters and 40% tomato. But when the tomatoes were in charge of the whole state, they resliced the district so it was only 45% onion, and the long-serving onion congressman lost his job. In an Illinois district, there was a part of Chicago that was primarily Hawaiian pizzas, sandwiched between a bunch of spinach neighborhoods. A fair way to slice the pizza would have had the Hawaiian slices distributed evenly with their neighbor. But Illinois did it a little different. These partisan pizza redistricting practices could be an explanation of why, in a country where 50% of voters went for cheese representatives and 50% went for pepperoni, the pepperoni could have more slices of the pie.
Okay, so as you can see, gerrymandering doesn't lead to fair districts. Let me now show you a different video that gives you a little bit better understanding of how this really influences the actual political elections themselves. So here we go, round 2. Sorry, long intro.
Most people have heard the word gerrymandering once or twice, probably during a presidential election. What exactly is gerrymandering?
Oh no, well that was ineffective. Let me pull up the other video, my apologies. Here we go, back it goes.
Essentially, it's the process of giving one political party an advantage over another political party by redrawing district lines. It's like Democrats trying to gain an advantage over Republicans, or Republicans trying to gain an advantage over Democrats. You see, each party wants to gain as many districts as possible so they can do things like control the state budget or set themselves up to win even more districts in the future. So, to understand how this process began and how it continues today, we must go back to 1812 in Massachusetts. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, supported and signed a bill to allow redistricting. That is, redrawing the boundaries that separate districts. The catch? The new lines would favor Gerry's own political party, the Democratic-Republican Party, which no longer exists. You see, Gerry wanted his party to win as many state Senate seats as possible. The more members of your party who vote, the more likely you are to win an election. The new lines were drawn to include loads of areas that would help Governor Gerry in the future. They were so strange-looking that someone said the new districts looked like a salamander. The Boston Gazette added Gerry's name to the word salamander, and voila! Gerrymandering, the process of dividing up and redrawing districts to give your political party an advantage. So how exactly does someone go about protecting their own political party and actually gerrymandering a district? There are 2 successful practices: packing a district and cracking a district. Packing is the process of drawing district lines and packing in your opponents like cattle into as few districts as possible. If more districts equals more votes, the fewer the districts there are, the fewer votes the opposition party will get. Packing, then, decreases the opponent's voter strength and influence. Cracking is the opposite, taking one district and cracking it into several pieces. This is usually done in districts where your opponent has many supporters. Cracking spreads these supporters out among many districts, denying your opponent a lot of votes. When you have a large number of people who would generally vote for one type of party, those folks are known as a voting bloc. Cracking is a way to break that all up. So when would a party choose to pack their opponent's districts rather than crack them? Well, that really depends on what the party needs. To dilute your opponent's voters, you could pack them into one district and leave the surrounding districts filled with voters of your own party. Or, if you and your party are in power when it's time to redraw district lines, you could redraw districts and crack up a powerful district and spread your opponent's voters out across several neighboring districts. So, Governor Jerry in 1812 wanted to gain an advantage for his party and redrew district lines in his state in such a crazy way, we have a whole new word and way of thinking about how political parties can gain advantages over their opponents. Politicians think of creative ways to draw districts every few years. So, the next time an election comes around and politicians ask people to vote, be sure to look up the shape of your district and the districts that surround it. How wide does your district stretch across your state? Are all of the districts in your state relatively the same shape? How many other districts does your district touch? But always be sure to ask yourself, does my district look like a salamander?
All right, there you go. So there's gerrymandering, and there is our flipped video. So go ahead and pause here. Here are your analysis questions, and I will see you soon.